Well, I grew up on an Indian reservation, and I think really like people who grew up in the South and had black servants and that sort of thing, it was the way things were. We interacted all the time. As a very young child, I would go back and forth from our house, which was right next to the trading post that my father owned, and would see the Indians there. They were always very pleasant to me. They laughed a lot, and I just didn't ever question it. We went to separate schools because the government had an Indian school in the teensy tiny town where I live, and we were bused to a school that was about 7 miles away. I was born in 1934, and so the part I remember the best was, between about probably 36 and 45 or 46 when I began to spend more time away from home. And this was in Utah, in the upper corner of Utah, on the Uinta Ute Reservation. My uncle had married an Indian woman. Uh, I loved her. She came to the house, and the family interacted with her. My grandmother, my southern grandmother, did not approve of that. It was not her son. It was my mother's brother who married the Indian woman. And my southern grandmother never ever invited her to her house. And I didn't really pay much attention to that either. She just wasn't there. And it wasn't like they were always around anyway. The difference between that and what I would discover was in the South was that there were no rules about it. The Indians weren't prohibited from going anywhere. There was nothing in restaurants or that sort of thing. The issue was whether they could pay. So the Indians on that reservation, like they are on most, were very poor. And I grew up recognizing that we were better off than most people. My parents were near bankruptcy a good part of my childhood, but we still had 2 cows in the backyard. We always had food. I never felt shortages. And we had electricity and running water, which most of the Indians did not have because they didn't live in regular homes. And none of the children that lived around the reservation, who would ride on the bus with me to go to school, had running water and electricity. So I knew we were better off than most folks. When I talk about African Americans, the only black people I ever saw when I was a child were in Salt Lake City, because Utah at that point was a very lily white state, apart from the Indians. And the only ones I ever saw were and it embarrasses me now to think about it, but there was a restaurant that was a family favorite in Salt Lake City that was called the Coon Chicken Inn. And I loved it because the waiters were so nice to me, and they were all black. When they came to take orders, they didn't ask my mother what I wanted, they asked me what I wanted. And I told him I wanted pineapple. And my mother was trying to argue with him, and he said, "We have pineapple, she'll have pineapple." And I just loved them. And these black waiters were dressed up like streetcar porters, not streetcar, railroad porters. And going into the Coon Chicken Inn, you walked through a porter's mouth. I mean, that was on the outside. It was years. I mean, it was not until I came south that I realized how appalling that was. I mean, it was just a fun thing for being a kid. The one time I'd ever heard uh, my father disagree with my grandmother. I mean, actually have an argument with her. She was a matriarch. Nobody argued with her. Marian Anderson had come to Salt Lake City to sing at the Mormon Tabernacle, and she was being housed at the Hotel Utah, which was owned, basically Mormon owned. She could stay there, but she had to use the servants' elevator. And my father was infuriated by that. And my grandmother thought that was perfectly normal. And so I was just sort of a fly in the wall, on the wall, listening to this, my father's voice getting louder and louder, which I had never experienced with my father and grandmother. The next time I came in any contact with African Americans was when I was in high school. I went away to boarding school when I was 11, almost 12. Both my brother and I went to this little Presbyterian boarding school, and each year that boarding school sent someone between their junior and senior years to California to go to what was called on a caravan. Basically, you went for training, and then you spent 6 weeks going around to working in camps or in various places, mostly with children. So I had that wonderful opportunity. We worked in Chinatown, which was all very interesting, but the thing that had the greatest impact on me was working in a camp with underprivileged children from Los Angeles. And I had a tent of 6 little boys. We ended up having a very good time that week, but the very first night we were there, after all the little boys had gotten quiet and I was lying there in the dark, not yet ready to sleep, this little voice piped up and said, "Miss?" And I said, "Yes, what is it?" He said, "Miss, I wish I was white." And I tear up when I think about it because I didn't know what to say. I had never heard anyone make a statement like that. And I had no idea what his pain was or why. I mean, he was the only black child in this group of 6, and I hadn't paid attention to what color they were much, but I know that he was the only black, and I think there were probably several Hispanics, and the others were white. But that haunted me because it was my first experience of that sort of thing. That would have been in 1951. The one with the greatest impact was coming to North Carolina for graduate school in 1956. And I had a cousin who came with me, and we drove across the country from Salt Lake City to North Carolina. And it was after we crossed the Mississippi that I began to see all of the white and colored signs everywhere you looked, every place we stopped. There was white only, and then maybe a colored somewhere for a restroom. And water fountains next, not, you know, 2 feet from each other, one labeled white and one labeled colored. And I, I was just absolutely appalled. I had read about this, I'd heard about it, of course. There were all these things that had happened, and then to see it really incorporated by law was stunning to me. And arriving in Chapel Hill, I made all kinds of errors because I didn't understand the um, the mores, and I was insulted the first time someone called me ma'am. Because I was a young woman, and you don't call people ma'am who are young. I introduced myself by my first name if I was introduced to a black person, and you weren't supposed to do that. They wouldn't call you by your first name. It was sort of a stunning experience at the time. One of the things I remember is that it was after I got to know Ed Johnson, who I would later marry, and they had a maid named Leela, who was a very friendly woman, and I really liked her, and they clearly really liked her. And I was taking laundry to the laundromat, and who was there but Leela? And so I put my laundry in, and I sat down and started talking to Leela, and we had a nice little conversation. When I next saw Ed's mother, she told me, Leela said she saw you at the laundromat. And she said, she's so common. And I did not realize that was not a compliment. That was saying I didn't know the rules. And I didn't realize it at the time, and it was only after Ed told me that that was not a compliment that I realized, oh my, I am common. And I can't be anything else. That's the way I was raised.
But I mean, the situation there is that you're not supposed to chat with a black person in the laundromat.
No, at that time. And this was Chapel Hill. It was supposed to be liberal. But it was not a liberal place. It followed the same rules as everybody else. After Ed and I married, and I had your dad, Ted, I hired someone to look after him because when he was 6 or 8 months old, I began to work 2 afternoons a week in the psychology department, and so I hired a woman to help who was black, and I learned from them sort of what you are supposed to do if you have hired someone, how you interact with them. They just basically taught me, and I was never quite comfortable with that. It's just, I don't know. They didn't have a child psychology program at UNC, but they had a clinical psychologist. So I was in the clinical psychology program. They knew that what I preferred was children, and so most of the practicum experiences and so forth I had were with children. That was one of the experiences I had during graduate school that ended up being important. In college, which was unusual at that time, I had taken courses in psychological testing. I had learned how to give the Stanford Binet. The Stanford Binet at that time was sort of the standard IQ test. Uh, and it had been used to study gifted children, used to define mental retardation. It was developed at Stanford by Alfred Binet, and it had good sampling, I mean, all of that, but it didn't include that many black children. I mean, people were just sort of unaware at that time. They just assessed lots of children, but they saw that younger children did a lot more things with their hands to indicate how they were doing than older children. And by the time you were 3, language became a very important part. They were looking at what counted for success later. The items they ended up with on the test related very well to how well people did in school later. And that was considered intelligence. And there was a research program that the psychology department was doing. Brown versus Board of Education was long since passed by this time, but there had been no integration at all in Chapel Hill. And in preparation for that and trying to understand what the consequences were going to be, someone in the psych department, I don't remember who, had a research project where they were testing all of the first graders in the Chapel Hill public. I don't know whether it was not all of them and all over the city. It couldn't have been. But I know they were at Glenwood. They were testing all of the first graders. They were giving them IQ tests and giving IQ tests to all of the children the same age in the black school. So I was out giving Stanford Benets, and I knew very well, and it was known by people generally, by psychologists generally, that the Stanford Binet is a very biased test because so much of it is language, and it becomes much more so each year you get older. And it's very based on your life experiences. And so it's not a real test of intelligence. Well, what the researchers were looking for was what are going to be the issues when you put all these kids together, what the effect going to be, and are there ways to mitigate that effect? And the latter is the more important part. What came out of that study was that the mean IQ in the black school for these children was 80, where the average is supposed to be 100. The mean IQ in Glenwood Elementary, where I was doing the testing, was 120. That's a huge difference, but the 120 was primarily an indication that that school particularly served almost entirely UNC faculty and graduate students. The children of UNC faculty and graduate students. So these kids had kindergarten, they had preschool, they had parents who read to them, they had all of those kinds of experiences. At that time, there were no public kindergartens in North Carolina. So if you went to kindergarten, it was you paid, and the black families couldn't pay. So you just knew the difference would be big, but it was stunning that it was that big. And it was a signal that integration in this town was going to be a problem. And I remember thinking, those poor kids, the black children, when they get into this school and they are that far behind, what is it going to do to their psyches? Because in their school they were average.
So when researchers come up with a biased test to get a sense of something, and the end result is the white children have an average IQ of 120 and the black children have an average IQ of 80, it's very easy to spin this as evidence that black people are biologically less intelligent.
Oh, yes. And this was, I mean, that was a whole movement. There had been books and papers published about black people are innately inferior cognitively to white people, but not recognizing what the tests were. And the fact that it was also related to success, not only in school, but elsewhere. It was a kind of topology or something going around so that you couldn't escape it. There were people actually arguing in journals at that point about whether intelligence was genetically built in. And there were papers published about black people are genetically more capable of athletics than white people. White people are more capable cognitively, and it was related to Darwin. White people had evolved more in the cognitive sense. I mean, it was so racially dominated. I mean, this was also the same period where they were still sterilizing black women so that because they were trying to improve the gene pool. You know, when you use the term right-wing propaganda, I don't think, I mean, I can't even think of it that way in that time. At that period of time, it was a scientific argument. What Hitler did in Europe was a part of the whole white belief generally. And in fact, I've read that Hitler used a lot of data that came from the U.S. To indicate, you know, that the Aryan race was superior. So it was an academic debate that I think many academics had settled in their mind, at least in this country, prior to World War II. I mean, the whole eugenics movement, all of that was related to this belief at the time that so much of what we are is born into us. I think the 50s saw a real trend toward saying nurture matters a great deal. It's not all nature. But it took a long time. I mean, the study that was being done at UNC, looking at the kids in these two schools, I think was trying to counter that and say it's not born in genetics. It has a lot to do with experience. While I was in college, that was a period in the 50s where they had really begun to look at how babies learn and how much is learned before a child is even a year old, and later how much they learn when they're in utero. So everything was moving in that direction. What we do when children are very young really matters in what their language will be like, what their behavior will be like. All of that matters all the way down. So that study at UNC was not to say they are inferior. It was basically to say, what are the differences and could something be done about it? Well, I left North Carolina. My husband had a job at Yale, so we lived outside of New Haven in Guilford, Connecticut, which was a lily white community. After Robert was born in '63, at a psychology party, I met Ed Ziegler, who was doing a lot of research on early intervention, and we were at a cocktail party, and I was talking to him, and found out that I knew how to give Stanford beignets because I had given them so many at Chapel Hill. And he said, "How would you like a job part time?" And so he hired me to come and work testing children in an experimental program in New Haven for disadvantaged children. They were using the IQ test as a measure of improvement over the year, not thinking of it as a measure of innate ability, but a measure of how much effect the education had had or these experiences had. So I was going to various preschools all over. The one school that ended up being the most interesting to me psychologically was the one that was right downtown New Haven, because the only requirement for getting into this free, wonderful preschool, which was also daycare for half a day, was that your income be below a certain level. Well, this particular school ended up having very close to half children of Yale graduate students and black children, just because of where they lived in the city. It was a wonderful experience to see how these kids interacted with each other. And testing them, it was clear the huge difference in, their language, what they had learned, all of those kinds of things. And the thing that I found most interesting, I don't think it was statistically significant with the small sample they had, but the improvement in the IQ scores was greater among the black children in that group than it was in any of the other groups.
Which merely because they were socializing with the children who were the
They
offspring.
were every day interacting with kids who had a broader vocabulary, who had had these other experiences. And that, to me, was such an example of why we need to integrate, but we need to do it very early, before children have put themselves in boxes that say, I'm not as competent as that person. So that to me was a very telling experience. It also gave me all the experience I needed to get my next job. So that was good. When we returned to Chapel Hill in 1966, when my oldest son was ready for kindergarten, and there were no public kindergartens, and the younger one, I wanted to be in preschool, but I had a brand new baby. By the next year, Ted, the oldest one, was starting public school, and it happened that year, 1967, was the first year that Chapel Hill fully integrated the schools. All of North Carolina had essentially been dealing with the requirement that we integrate with what they call token integration, which was one or two poor black children. Usually they were hand-picked, so they were not the ones who were most disadvantaged, but were being put in white schools and saying, well, we're working on it. Chapel Hill was actually one of the earlier ones. The year before they fully integrated, they had integrated all ninth graders so that they would be not totally unused to each other by the time they entered high school. But Ted began in the first grade the year that the school's fully integrated. And there were, in this liberal community, there were people who had fought it tooth and nail. but it ended up happening. And I remember when I took Ted into his first grade classroom, I looked at the teacher's desk, and on her desk was this bunch of books. And uh, they were all related to integrating children of different abilities, different races in your classroom. I mean, I don't remember the titles, but I thought she's probably going to be pretty good. And she ended up being wonderful. But by this time, Ted was at Glenwood School. This was the school I had originally worked in, where the kids had an average IQ of 120. By this time, I was working at the hospital, and with all of this integration, they needed people to test children who were doing poorly so they could decide whether they were eligible for special education or not. And again, we're using the good old Stanford Binet on the younger children, and and using 65 as a cutoff, and below that they were considered retarded. So the hospital released me to spend part of my time working at Glenwood School doing their testing for them. Glenwood was very crowded, having been integrated, and there was not even a closet for me to do the testing in, so they had a screen that they put up on one end of one hall, and I sat behind that with children and tested them. So I was aware of what was going on in the school. The children who had the benefit of being in the integrated schools in the first and second grades probably handled the rest of their school experience a lot better. The older they got, the harder it was. The high school was a total disaster. But I worked with someone who had a child at the high school and described just all kinds of terrible things. They were having fights. People were stealing people's lunches. I mean, there were all kinds of just weird things going on, and the kids didn't feel real safe in school. But there were groups of people that I've learned about since who were really working hard to try to make it work, and who were inviting the black students to their homes and all of that. But Chapel Hill went about it in a bass-ackward way. The black high school had won all kinds of awards, athletic awards, for football. And Chapel Hill High School had not. And when they integrated them, what did they do? The coach for the integrated high school was the white coach. They built this whole new high school that they didn't integrate until they had this whole new high school, which was outside of town, and that put a burden on black parents who would then have to go pick up their kids because there was no bus. When they put the awards up for games and that sort of thing in the halls, now I never saw this, but what I read about it was that all of the awards that won by the black school, which was Lincoln High School, this was now Chapel Hill High, the same name as the Chapel Hill High that had been downtown. All of the awards were the Chapel Hill High awards. And one black student described seeing their awards in the trash can. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what he described, and I believe it. So those black students arrived there knowing that they weren't welcome. And it took a long time to overcome that, I think. And I'm not sure it ever completely did. But I had a neighbor. She was very much a liberal, do-good kind of person. she called me up and said that she had been working with a number of black parents at Glenwood School who were really upset about the way their children were being treated at the school. And would I be willing to come in my role as a psychologist and a parent to a meeting with these parents? They were upset that their children were being sent to the principal more often. They were equally upset or even more upset about the fact that they were being called all the time because their children were behavior problems. So she was asking me to meet with this group of black parents, and I said, well, sure, I'll be glad to meet with them. I didn't know what I would have to say. But the women started talking about the fact that their children, when they were at Northside, they were doing just fine. Nobody ever called them about behavior problems. And at Glenwood, they were getting called day in and day out, and they were tired of it, and they felt that the kids were being discriminated against and so forth. So they started talking about punishment and what would be appropriate. And one of the white mothers said, oh, well, when my son misbehaves in class, the teacher sends him out into the hall. And he was so humiliated, he never did that again. And one of the black mothers just let out this wonderful big belly laugh. And she said, oh, my child gets sent out every day and he loves it. And I thought that was, I knew that child because there was a little boy in the hall where I tested, there was a little boy that came out practically every day while I was testing and ran up and down the hall and ran up and down the hall for the whole time. And I wondered, why in the world is he out running up and down the hall? And so at that point, I said to the group, I think we need some help in understanding what kind of discipline there ought to be. And to a person, all of the black mothers were for corporal punishment. I mean, what they did was give their kid a swat, and then he shaped up. And they said that. And they expected the teachers to do the same. Well, the teachers weren't going to do the same. And if they happened to hit a white kid, they would be in trouble. I was working at a center that was evaluating children with developmental disabilities, and we had just recently gotten a new psychologist on the staff who had just graduated from one of the stellar programs in the country in in behavioral psychology. And so I went back and told her about this whole experience and asked her if she might be willing to provide some consultation to the teachers at Glenwood. So she went over and did workshops at the school, and they made a tremendous difference. So that while in my son's class there had been no behavior problems, through the rest of the school there had been a lot. There still continued to be complaints. They had a trailer on campus that was sort of extra classroom space, and they would put children who were really out of control in timeout. I mean, they weren't stuck in a room by themselves, but an adult would sit in the room and ignore them while they had their tantrum or whatever. And some of the black parents thought that was cruel. So the problems didn't entirely go away, but they reduced a great deal. And the principal, I think, was extremely grateful. I guess the main contribution I gave, besides talking to Carolyn about doing it, was getting the principal to agree to it. And that didn't require much, because she was at her wit's end. she was spending her day with little black boys running in and out of her room and not having any effect. She was a very powerful woman. I wouldn't have done anything bad if I was a kid, and I would have feared being sent to her office. But these kids didn't fear being sent to her office because she wasn't going to hit them. And one of the things that was most rewarding to me, as your dad particularly, as he was growing up, is that he was so involved in recreational activity. After school, we would go through a neighborhood that was mostly black families and pick up his teammates to take them to practice and come back, so we got to know those kids. And he made the statement after he went to high school that one of the things he disliked about it was that he no longer had all his black friends. All of their after school activities were so different. It began to happen in junior high school.
So the students started to self-segregate.
They self-segregated because of A, transportation, and B, the white parents had their kids in music lessons. They had them in all kinds of life-enriching experiences that other people couldn't afford. And so it ended up, creating segregation again.
Do you have anything more to say about hypocrisy of Chapel Hill liberals?
No, except that I think it's in all of us. We like to think we're not, but I think we all have it, and we all have gut reactions to our life experiences. I remember standing behind 3 black young men with their pants hanging low, and they're at Walmart. I think it was Walmart, and they had this cart loaded with stuff, and they were in 3 or 10 items only lane. I was behind them, and I was thinking, oh, what's going to happen when that clerk tells them they're in the wrong line? And then one of the kids looked up and he said, "Hey, man, we're in the wrong line." And he came out, moved, and went around, and I saw they had a bunch of Duke paraphernalia, and I thought, those are Duke students. I was thinking they were boys of the hood and expecting some bad interchange. So it's sitting there in back of our heads every day. And it's not only white folks, I think it's in everybody. I remember reading a column by Barry Sanders, who's a black columnist for the News and Observer, and he was talking about how people would react to him, getting out of his car in a parking lot to avoid him or something. And the other, he said, "But when I see this black dude get into the car, I'm avoiding him too." So he said that, he was trying to make fun of it, but I think it's true that there are people, the way people dress, as well as the color of their skin, does all kinds of things to our internal barometers. And it's sad that much of it's related to race, but it is.
Off the top of your head, are there any reforms that you think would make a big difference here and are actually achievable?
Oh, I think that free preschool starting at age 3 would make a tremendous difference. But it would require that they have well-trained teachers. I mean, I think we should have certification that is much stronger for, but you can't do that if you're only paying a minimum wage, which is what they're doing. So uh, you can't just warehouse kids and say we're going to have a preschool program. You have to have a preschool program with people who are prepared to be good teachers. And that would be expensive. But again, it's a lot cheaper than paying for prisons. And I think it would go a long way in doing something about that. I've always felt that we live in a world of different people, different backgrounds, different abilities, and whatever. And that to put a child in a, to raise a child in a situation where he doesn't interact with people that are different than he or she is not fair to that person. Uh, and I'm a strong proponent of public schools. I dislike vouchers. I dislike uh, all of the alternatives that people come up with, which are basically taking us back to segregated schools. Um, and segregated not just by race but by economics. And I hate to see it, because if we're going to get along, we have to know each other.